Musa Qala in late 2007 was a town shaped by years of conflict. Its streets showed signs of repeated fighting, damaged buildings, craters from explosions, and checkpoints manned by Afghan soldiers. The people who lived there faced daily uncertainty, caught between the Taliban insurgents and coalition forces trying to establish control. The town's importance went beyond its size. Situated in Helmand province, Musa Qala controlled key routes through one of Afghanistan's most volatile regions. For NATO and Afghan government forces, holding this town was crucial to disrupting insurgent operations and securing a wider area. For the Taliban, it was a symbol of resistance and a base from which they could project their power and control their growing opium empire. Both sides understood the stakes. Control of Musa Qala would influence not just military operations, but also local governance, security, and the future of the surrounding communities. The situation was tense, with an uneasy calm masking the likelihood of renewed violence. In the coming days, a major offensive will be launched to retake the town from Taliban control. This battle would test the capabilities of Afghan forces and coalition troops alike, while highlighting the wider challenges of the war in southern Afghanistan. Musa Qala was not just another place on the Afghan map. It was a focal point in a conflict defined by complex politics, shifting alliances, and the struggle for influence in a region caught between competing forces. Welcome to Wars of the World. By 2006, 5 years had passed since the Taliban were ousted, yet Afghanistan remained far from peace. The mission for the NATO-led ISAF, the International Security Assistance Force, had entered its pivotal Stage 3, expanding south in July 2006 to include Helmand, Kandahar, Uruzgan, and 3 other provinces. The aim was to extend government control and to rebuild infrastructure. But the alliance lacked the numbers for a sustained campaign. ISAF forces doubled from around 10,000 to over 20,000, yet still felt overstretched in Helmand's dust-choked villages. Within this framework, the UK deployed Task Force Helmand in summer 2006, centred on the 16th Air Assault Brigade with around 3,300 troops. Initial plans emphasised reconstruction and governance. Defence Secretary John Reid once remarked, quote, "We would be perfectly happy to leave in 3 years and without firing one shot, because our job is to protect the reconstruction." End quote. Yet reality swiftly diverged. Taliban resistance grew fierce, with the emergent platoon house strategy entrenching small, vulnerable outposts in district centres like Sangin, Nowzad, and critically, Musa Qala. Musa Qala, located along the Helmand River, wasn't simply important for its location. It was a lifeline for the region's most lucrative industry, opium. Helmand province produced more than half of all Afghan opium by 2008, with estimates showing an increase of 66% over national output. The district town served as a critical nexus, acting as one of the country's main collection, processing and distribution points. According to the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, when British and ISAF forces recaptured Musa Qala in late 2007, they discovered drug labs in operation and open markets for narcotics. This narcotics activity wasn't isolated either. It was fused into the Taliban's financial model. Across Helmand, Taliban commanders broke the long-standing ban on opium, then imposed a levy on its cultivation and trafficking, effectively funding their insurgency with drug money. With the Taliban offering protection, poppy cultivation in Musa Qala reportedly surged by over 660% between 2005 and 2008, a reflection of both the lucrative opportunity and the erosion of central government control. The importance of Musa Qala extended beyond its narcotics, however. At the crossroads between the Bagran and Sangin valleys, the town controlled essential trade and movement routes. Its bazaar drew villagers from surrounding areas, and while the district centre itself held only a few thousand residents, its sphere of influence spanned tens of thousands. For NATO, this meant that controlling this centre equated to projecting power across an expansive rural catchment, critical for military operations and political legitimacy on both sides of the conflict. On June 14, 2006, the thinly stretched British Pathfinder platoon, only about 25 reconnaissance specialists, was dispatched to garrison Musa Qala. Almost immediately, they came under sustained attack, pinned down and dependent on helicopter resupply under enemy fire. Chinooks and Apaches became frequent visitors, often arriving under RPG and machine gun assault to rescue casualties or to reinforce positions. General David Richards, the ISAF commander at the time, noted the situation, quote, "The immediate vicinities of the platoon houses became areas where the average civilian with any sense left, and his home was destroyed." End quote. Beyond the military threat, relations with local elders were uneasy. Authority in Helmand was deeply tribal, and many British fears centred around Governor Akhundzada, later replaced by Dawood, whose engineering background didn't command grassroots confidence. These tensions compounded physical danger, alienated the tribal elders, and limited ISAF's access to intelligence and resources. By late summer 2006, casualty figures underlined the tenuous situation. Some 31 British soldiers had fallen in Helmand alone up to September, many in Musa Qala and Sangin. Faced with mounting losses and isolated garrisons, commanders began exploring unconventional approaches. Whispers of open negotiations with tribal leaders were circulating, hinting at a local ceasefire as a potential alternative to full-scale withdrawal. In September 2006, under mounting pressure and rising casualties in Musa Qala, British forces and the Helmand provincial governor, Mohammed Dawood, brokered a local solution. 15 tribal elders agreed to guarantee the security of the district centre, pledging to uphold the Afghan flag and bar all armed groups, coalition and Taliban alike, from the town. In exchange, British troops withdrew beyond a 5-kilometre exclusion zone, leaving only a small, locally trained police contingent, albeit hampered by delays in training and recruitment. This unprecedented move triggered immediate debate. British proponents framed it as a pragmatic, Afghan-led counterinsurgency, while critics within the ISAF, a number of US officials among them, expressed alarm. US Ambassador Ronald Newman warned that it risked legitimizing a Taliban-dominated sanctuary, and General Richards cautioned the withdrawing could turn these centres into magnets for the Taliban. The deal had President Karzai's conditional blessing, but lacked full central authority, unfolding largely as a provincial initiative. Initially, the agreement held promise. Over the next 5 months, fighting in the town centre declined significantly, shops and schools reopened, and even a Taliban attempt to enter was rebuffed by local elders. But serious weaknesses also emerged. Only 19 of the intended 50 local police completed their training, leaving security fragile. Moreover, provincial and national political fault lines, combined with US derision and uneven development aid, undermined its durability. The atmosphere of calm brought about by the agreement proved to be short-lived. In February 2007, the agreement collapsed. It was following an ISAF airstrike that killed a local Taliban commander's brother, an action which they claimed to be just beyond the exclusion zone, but was seen by insurgents as a breach. In retaliation, around 200 to 300 Taliban militants stormed the town, disarmed the police, jailed elders, and burned the district governor's office along with the police station. They raised the white flag of the Taliban, expelled collaborators, and swiftly transformed Musa Qala into a flagrant center of insurgent authority. Taliban rule in Musa Qala was not merely military, it was also ideological. They implemented strict Sharia law, banning music, enforcing dress codes, and instituting public punishments. Local radio stations branded Sharia radio broadcast religious directives and Taliban propaganda, reinforcing their narrative of occupation resistance and Islamist legitimacy. As the Taliban entrenched themselves, Musa Qala became a potent recruitment center and propaganda hub, emboldening insurgent messaging far beyond its small population. The transformation of Musa Qala from a contested district center into a Taliban stronghold represented a dramatic shift. It was no longer a symbolic gesture or political gambit. Instead, it became a location of insurgent governance and tactical advantage. By the time of the Taliban takeover, the town had evolved into a staging ground for cross-district operations, effectively challenging NATO and Afghan authority. The failure of this deal illustrated not only the fragility of local pacts in asymmetric warfare, but also how power vacuums were exploited by insurgents. This stark reversal underscored the need for a decisive military response. NATO could no longer hope that local agreements or fragile governance could contain the insurgency. Musa Qala had become both a symbolic victory for the Taliban and a decisive threat, one that demanded a full-scale counter-offensive. By late November 2007, after nearly a year as a Taliban-held stronghold, Musa Qala had become both a political embarrassment and a strategic necessity for ISAF. It was at this critical juncture that Operation Snakebite, also referred to as Mar Karadad in Pashto, was greenlit by senior Allied commanders, including US General Dan K. McNeill. The operation, planned under the command of UK-led 52nd Infantry Brigade, marked a pivotal shift. The Afghan National Army, or ANA, would lead the assault, with ISAF forces in support, an international effort to demonstrate growing Afghan self-reliance. At the centre of planning was Brigadier Andrew McKay, who had assumed command in October 2007 and quickly impressed both his troops and observers with his unorthodox leadership. When the initial attack was approved, codenamed Operation Mar, meaning snake, he reportedly walked nearly a mile through no man's land to command from the front on Roshan Hill, accompanied by only a small team, earning him reputations for courage and direct engagement. ANA Commander General Mohayyedin Ghori was designated to lead the ground advance, backed by US Special Forces advisors and British support, underlining the coalition's commitment to a genuine Afghan-led offensive. The overarching strategic intent was clear: reassert governmental authority in Musa Qala and symbolically reinforce the ANA's capability as a fighting force. This had followed months in which coalition commanders had felt hampered by NATO's empty clear and hold campaigns, often referred to as simply mowing the lawn, which had led to Taliban fighters simply biding their time before re-emerging. Musa Qala represented a more focused demonstration of counterinsurgency principles. Carve out clear zones, instill confidence in local populations, and to create a visible government presence. Planning took place under intense scrutiny, both military and political. The UK Ministry of Defence, Parliament, and Prime Minister's Office were watching closely, with McKay even receiving instructions directly from Downing Street, which told him to postpone the assault, which coincided with a high-profile visit, instructions which he declined. Embedding military reporters and issuing informational leaflets to civilian populations also became central to the strategy, ensuring that the operation's narrative would emphasize its Afghan leadership and concern for civilian welfare. Yet the groundwork laid in the field was what truly defined the operation. Beginning in early November, coalition units, including the Brigade Reconnaissance Force, the Scots Guard, and 40 Commando Royal Marines conducted extensive reconnaissance patrols, mapping Taliban defences and supply routes. Approaches were cleared gradually from both flanks, in a slow-moving, methodical way, designed to minimise civilian displacement. Intelligence gathering also played a vital part. Crucially, coalition forces worked to detach influential Taliban-aligned tribal leaders, most significantly Mullah Abdul Salam, a Pirzai Alizai elder, rumoured to be negotiating defection. This came as a means to sap the insurgents' local support. When describing the strategy, Brigadier McKay said, quote, "The intent was to begin wearing the Taliban down, dislocate them, punch them hard when they ventured out, lower their morale, and begin to separate out the Tier 1, the key leaders and more ideologically driven, and the Tier 2, the guns for hire, not in it for the long haul." End quote. The planners were acutely aware of several factors which made this situation particularly dangerous. Firstly was the terrain and IEDs. Musa Qala lay at the centre of rugged, maze-like farmland, crisscrossed by irrigation canals, which made this area ideal for ambushes. Taliban had emplaced extensive minefields and IEDs, with early phase casualties including Sergeant Lee Johnson, who was killed by a roadside mine. Alongside this was the urban defence. The town itself was heavily fortified. Taliban combatants had turned homes and mosques into firing positions and created a roughly 500-metre buffer zone around coalition outposts. Another factor to consider was the civilian presence. With hundreds of villagers still in the area, planners coordinated leaflet drops and offered evacuation routes to reduce risks, recalling lessons of past kill zones in Nowzad and Sangin, where population flight destabilized recaptured zones. Despite these risks, the political imperative was strong. The success of Operation Snakebite would validate the ANA, vindicate British command strategies, and deliver a rare symbolic victory that might shift narrative momentum after years of incremental gains. Failure, on the other hand, would once again highlight the vulnerabilities of Helmand's counterinsurgency model and risk providing fresh propaganda fuel to these insurgents hostile to foreign intervention. On the 7th of December 2007, at around 1600 hours, Operation Snakebite commenced with an intense air and ground assault. US Army infantry from the 82nd Airborne Division were airdropped from 19 helicopters, including Chinooks and Blackhawks, to the north of Musa Qala. Supported by Apache gunships, they aimed to seize the strategic Roshan Hill. As darkness fell, American paratroopers breached Taliban trench lines and consolidated defensive positions ready for the main attack. Simultaneously, Afghan National Army units, backed by British forces, advanced from the south, west and east. Brigadier General Gul Aka Naibi later described the air and ground pincer as having Musa Qala encircled, designed to leave the Taliban with no easy escape. According to The Guardian, roughly 4,500 NATO and Afghan troops faced off against an estimated 2,000 Taliban defenders. US airstrikes reportedly eliminated 12 insurgents, including a Taliban commander, with Taliban spokesman Qari Yusuf Ahmadi later confirming that they had withdrawn to avoid civilian harm, stating their retreat followed, quote, "massive bombardment," end quote. Heavy resistance ensued, particularly from fortified homes and mosques, with Taliban utilizing civilian areas for tactical advantage. IEDs and mines posed a constant threat, with US soldier Corporal Tanner J. O'Leary being killed on December 9th by an IED. An embedded British journalist, Stephen Gray, for the BBC, recounted, quote, "As we approached, we saw families of refugees fleeing Musa Qala in trucks and cars, loaded with their possessions. Just as two of such vehicles were being stopped and checked for hidden weapons, the Taliban opened fire, sending us diving for what little cover there was and marking the beginning of a gun battle that continued for several hours. In the midst of the fighting, the two refugee vehicles drove away in a panic from the village, but straight towards two American Humvees, which opened fire, fearing the ever-present threat of suicide bombs. 3 of the civilians were killed, and 2 children and a woman injured." End quote. This tragic event underscored the complexities of warfare among civilians and insurgents. But the coalition strategy was designed to prompt Taliban withdrawal rather than full urban combat. By the morning of December 10th, ANA and NATO troops entered the town centre. ISAF confirmed Taliban forces had fled following heavy bombardment, with Afghan troops installing checkpoints at the marketplace. Brigadier General Naibi stated that exchanges of fire were continuing into the evening and blamed foreign fighters or Al-Qaeda members for the remaining resistance. In regards to the remaining work to be done, Naibi said, quote, "The town is surrounded. We are about 500 meters away from the Musa Qala market in the center of the town. The bombing continues. The area is big. Tomorrow we will carefully clear the streets from the mines." End quote. The operation formed a stark contrast to prior expectations. Coalition commanders had prepared for fierce house-to-house urban combat, but the Taliban had opted largely to withdraw into surrounding farmland. This influenced certain outcomes. Coalition casualties were relatively limited, with 1 British and 1 American soldier being killed in IED incidents, and several more being wounded. On the other side, Taliban losses were estimated as hundreds killed or captured, though precise figures remain unverified. The civilians here suffered as well. Local elders later claimed up to 40 civilian deaths, though coalition spokesmen dismissed this as Taliban disinformation. Ultimately, fighting in urban areas was less ferocious than feared, as one senior US officer observed, quote, "The urban centre of Musa Qala was not significantly opposed. It was not significantly barricaded." End quote. Still, combat in peripheral villages like Karamanda and Salam Bazaar continued beyond the town centre, employing small arms fire and hit-and-run tactics. Clearing operations persisted over the following days, supported by US air power targeting residual pockets of Taliban insurgents. By December 11th, NATO officially announced Musa Qala's capture. The raised Afghan flag over the district centre symbolised both tactical victory and a message of state authority being restored. Yet beneath the veneer of triumph lay enduring questions about civilian impact, Taliban dispersal into remote areas, and the longevity of ANA control. With the Taliban driven from Musa Qala in December 2007, Afghan government forces swiftly moved to re-establish a visible presence, with the Afghan flag now restored over the district centre's town hall. Brigadier General Gul Aka Naibi emphasised the importance of this act, declaring it a, quote, "sign of hope for the people of Musa Qala and Helmand province." End quote. However, the tactical victory was only the first step. Efforts to stabilise the town faced immediate challenges. Infrastructure was badly damaged, and the security environment remained fragile. ANA soldiers and coalition forces worked to clear mines and unexploded ordnance, while engineers began repairing roads and restoring water supplies. Establishing a functional local governance proved more difficult, however. Many tribal leaders, wary after previous betrayals and ongoing violence, hesitated to collaborate fully with Afghan authorities or NATO forces. Despite NATO's military success, the broader strategic picture was more ambiguous. The Taliban's tactical withdrawal during the battle meant that they were not decisively defeated. Instead, they retreated to surrounding villages and the countryside, preserving the ability to regroup. Over the following months, insurgent influence gradually returned through intimidation, recruitment, and the exploitation of local grievances. The opium trade, critical to the local economy and Taliban financing, remained largely intact. undermining government efforts to stabilise the area. British commanders expressed a tempered optimism, with Brigadier Andrew Mackay, who had planned Operation Snakebite, cautioning that the fight for Musa Qala was far from over. Quote, "We have taken the town, but the real battle is winning the hearts and minds of the people. Without that, military gains mean little." End quote. Afghan officials echoed this sentiment, acknowledging the deep-rooted tribal dynamics and economic drivers fueling the conflict. A local elder observed, quote, "The government comes and goes, but the people here want peace and respect for our traditions. Without that, the cycle of violence will continue." End quote. Ultimately, the story of Musa Qala encapsulated the broader Afghan conflict. A hard-won military success, shadowed by fragile governance, enduring insurgency, and the persistent challenge of addressing the root causes of instability. The battle was a crucial chapter, but far from the final word in Helmand's long struggle and the ongoing conflict in Afghanistan.